The news cycle has already shifted. Cameras have packed up, anchors have moved on, and the moment that looked decisive on television has been filed away as a completed event. But what unfolded was never meant to end with a broadcast. What happened in Venezuela cannot be understood as a single arrest, a dramatic extraction, or even a foreign policy decision. It only makes sense when you stop looking at faces and start looking at systems. This wasn't about personalities or ideology. It was about pressure accumulating inside economic machinery until one component finally snapped. The public was shown an action scene. The real story lives underneath. In trade flows, currency arrangements, refinery constraints, and long-running structural dependencies that rarely make headlines. For years, the groundwork was laid quietly. Restrictions tightened not all at once, but steadily. Banking access narrowed. Insurance vanished. Shipping routes were rerouted. Energy markets adapted in ways most people never notice, because the consequences are delayed. At the same time, China deepened its economic presence across South America, not with speeches, but with contracts, ports, financing, and logistics. Venezuela didn't suddenly become strategic. It became impossible to ignore. What looks sudden is actually the final stage of a process that began when negotiations stopped working and leverage replaced persuasion. This is why timing matters more than rhetoric. This is why the official explanations keep shifting. And this is why the inconsistencies in public statements tell you more than the statements themselves. Turn on any major network and you see the same images replayed from different angles. Aircraft cutting through the night, a head of state taken into custody, analysts applauding execution and resolve. The focus is deliberate. If attention stays on the choreography, no one asks what forced the choreography to begin with. This was never about democratic values or criminal indictments. It was about settling accounts that could no longer be settled on paper. There is an unspoken rule in global politics that everyone knows and few admit. You cannot indefinitely isolate countries that sit on resources your system still depends on. You can delay the reckoning, but you cannot cancel it. For more than 2 decades, Washington tested that rule. Assets were frozen, sanctions expanded, alternative leaders were recognized, opposition groups were funded, diplomatic pressure mounted. Everything was attempted except direct seizure. That approach held until it didn't. When it collapsed openly, revealing how little flexibility remained. The moment that exposes the contradiction came quietly. Late December, Caracas finalized major energy agreements with Beijing. Almost immediately afterward, back-channel outreach began, not with threats, but with requests. Access was being sought to something that policy had spent years trying to dismantle. That wasn't diplomacy in the classic sense. It was necessity asserting itself. For years, the public was told a comforting story about energy independence. Domestic production was framed as a shield against global turbulence. The headline numbers were real, but the conclusion was misleading. What matters is not just how much oil is produced, but what kind. The bulk of American output is light crude, easier to refine in some contexts, but incompatible with the infrastructure that actually keeps the system running. The largest refineries in the Gulf were built decades ago to process heavy crude. Retrofitting them is neither quick nor cheap. You can produce record volumes and still face shortages if the inputs don't match the machinery. For a long time, this mismatch was managed through imports from the Middle East. That arrangement is fraying. Key producers are no longer willing to act as price stabilizers for someone else's economy. Output cuts are strategic. Alignments are shifting. Calls from Washington increasingly go unanswered. At the same time, a critical buffer was quietly drained. Strategic reserves, designed for wars and disasters, were used to smooth domestic prices. That relief was temporary. The inventory was not restored. What remains is a thin margin in a world where disruptions are becoming more frequent, not less. When policymakers surveyed the landscape, the options were limited. Canada was already operating near capacity. Russia was inaccessible. The Gulf was unreliable. One major source remained, not because of current output, but because of potential and compatibility. Venezuela's reserves dwarf almost everyone else's. Even underinvestment and decay couldn't erase that reality. The issue was never about barrels available tomorrow. It was about who would shape the system those barrels would eventually flow through. For half a century, oil has done more than power engines. It has anchored a monetary order. Pricing energy in dollars created constant global demand for U.S. currency, allowing borrowing on favorable terms and cushioning the consequences of debt expansion. That arrangement depended on compliance, not just from allies, but from producers. Recently, that compliance has weakened. Major transactions are increasingly settled in alternative currencies. New payment rails are being built. What was once unthinkable is becoming routine. Venezuela was moving toward full integration with that emerging architecture. The significance wasn't immediate volume, it was precedent. A resource holder of that scale operating outside dollar-based settlement would signal that the system is optional, not mandatory. That is the threat that doesn't show up in sound bites. The dollar is no longer backed by metal or manufacturing dominance. It rests on usage. Reduce usage and the math changes quickly. This context explains why pressure escalated when it did, not because of a sudden moral awakening or a newly discovered violation, but because a line was about to be crossed that couldn't easily be uncrossed. Accepting a multipolar settlement system would require adjustment and compromise. Force offered the illusion of control. From a tactical standpoint, the operation achieved its immediate objective. From a structural standpoint, it opened questions that don't have clean answers. What happens next matters more than what already happened. Removing an individual does not dissolve a system that distributes power through institutions, incentives, and parallel economies. Venezuela's state apparatus is not centralized in one office. It is layered through military, commercial, and territorial control. Those structures don't disappear because cameras leave, and the rest of the world is watching closely, not to be impressed, but to calculate risk. This is only the beginning of the story, not the conclusion. The spectacle has ended. The consequences are just starting to surface. What followed the extraction was silence where clarity should have been. Questions about governance, continuity, and authority were met with vague assurances and improvised remarks. That absence matters because power vacuums don't remain empty. They fill themselves, usually with whatever forces are already closest to the levers of money and coercion. In this case, those forces were never dismantled. Ministries remained staffed. Command structures stayed intact. Economic choke points were still controlled by the same actors who had managed them for years. Removing the figure at the top altered the optics, not the mechanics. This is where historical analogies become dangerous if they're applied carelessly. Comparisons to smaller interventions miss scale and complexity. Venezuela is not a narrow corridor with a single strategic asset and a population measured in single digits of millions. It is a continental-sized economy with layered dependencies and a population large enough to absorb shocks unevenly. More importantly, power there has long been transactional rather than ideological. Loyalty is purchased through access to revenue streams, not speeches. Any attempt to reshape the system without immediately addressing those flows invites fragmentation. The military is central to this equation, but not in the conventional sense. It does not function solely as a defense institution. It operates as an economic network. Senior officers oversee logistics, mining, food distribution, fuel transport, and port operations. Promotions are tied less to battlefield performance than to successful management of monopolies. This structure evolved under pressure, hardened by sanctions, and adapted to scarcity. It is resilient precisely because it is decentralized. Taking out a single node does not collapse the network. From the outside, it is tempting to assume that economic hardship automatically translates into political collapse. History suggests otherwise. Scarcity often strengthens internal discipline among elites while shifting the burden downward. Ordinary citizens absorb the cost while power brokers adjust. That pattern has repeated itself across sanctioned states for decades. What changes outcomes is not deprivation alone, but the realignment of incentives at the top. So far, there is little evidence that such a realignment has occurred. Internationally, the signal sent was unambiguous, even if it wasn't intended that way. The action reframed currency choice as a security issue. For countries already experimenting with alternative settlement systems, this reinforced existing concerns. The question being asked quietly in capitals across the global south is not whether diversification is wise, but whether delay increases vulnerability. Once that calculation shifts, momentum builds quickly. At the same time, parallel systems are no longer theoretical. They are operational. Payment networks that bypass traditional clearing mechanisms are processing real volume. Trade agreements increasingly include currency flexibility clauses. Commodity contracts are being written with settlement baskets instead of single units. None of this requires headlines to be effective. It only requires repetition. Each transaction completed outside the old framework reduces dependence incrementally. Those increments add up. China's role in this environment is often misunderstood. It is not acting as a revolutionary force, but as a patient builder of infrastructure. Ports, railways, energy facilities, and financial links form an ecosystem. Once built, they are difficult to unwind. Latin American trade patterns reflect this reality. The gravitational pull is economic, not ideological. Countries sell where demand is stable and financing is available. They buy from whoever offers reliable terms. Loyalty follows logistics. This is why attempts to reverse the trend through coercion carry long-term costs. Even allies begin to hedge. Public alignment masks private diversification. No government wants to explain to its population why access to reserves, markets, or financing disappeared overnight because of a policy decision made elsewhere. Risk management becomes policy. Alternatives are explored quietly until they are viable enough to use openly. Markets, for now, are choosing optimism. There is an assumption that production will recover, contracts will be rewritten, and flows will normalize. That assumption rests on the belief that technical challenges are the primary obstacle. In reality, political fragmentation and legitimacy gaps are harder to resolve than infrastructure decay. Engineers can be imported, trust cannot. Investment requires predictability, and predictability requires authority that is widely recognized, not just announced. If that authority fractures, outcomes multiply. Regional leaders may assert control over assets in exchange for protection or revenue sharing. Smuggling networks may expand to fill distribution gaps. External actors may support different factions indirectly to protect their stakes. None of this produces rapid stabilization. It produces managed instability, where no single actor has enough power to impose order, but several have enough to block it. There is also the question of response from outside the hemisphere. Economic pressure does not always arrive in obvious forms. It can take the shape of delayed investments, rerouted supply chains, or unfavorable terms offered elsewhere. Leverage is often exercised where attention is lowest. A dispute in one country becomes a bargaining chip in another. This is how great power competition actually unfolds, not through declarations, but through trade-offs. What is striking is how little of this complexity is reflected in official messaging. Statements emphasize resolve and success while glossing over sustainability. There is confidence in execution, but ambiguity in outcome. That imbalance is not new, but it is increasingly risky in a system where feedback loops are shorter. Information travels faster, reactions compound, miscalculations propagate. The deeper issue is credibility. For decades, participation in the dollar-centered system was framed as mutually beneficial. Stability was the selling point, predictability was the reward. When enforcement shifts from rules to force, that narrative weakens. Compliance becomes a matter of fear rather than interest. Fear works, but it is expensive. It requires constant reinforcement. And every use of it accelerates the search for exits. None of this means collapse is imminent or inevitable. Systems rarely break all at once. They erode, they adapt, they coexist with challengers for long periods, but direction matters. The trajectory now is toward pluralism in finance and trade, whether managed or chaotic. The choice is not between dominance and irrelevance. It is between shaping change and reacting to it. What happened in Venezuela should be understood as a stress test, not a conclusion. It revealed how much leverage remains and how much has already slipped away. It demonstrated capability, but also dependence. Above all, it showed that the tools being used belong to an earlier era, while the environment they are being applied to has already changed. The final consequence is not decided by what was taken, but by what was revealed. Power is most effective when it doesn't have to announce itself. The moment it does, observers start measuring its limits. That is what this episode exposed. The operation demonstrated reach, but it also clarified dependency. It showed that access to resources is no longer guaranteed by markets alone, and that the old assumption of automatic compliance is no longer safe. Once that assumption breaks, every actor recalculates. For countries watching from the outside, the lesson is not subtle. If sovereignty can be overridden when economic alignment shifts, then alignment itself becomes a security risk. That doesn't push states toward loyalty. It pushes them toward redundancy. Multiple banking relationships, multiple settlement currencies, multiple export destinations. Resilience becomes the goal, not partnership. This is how blocs harden, not through speeches, but through insurance. The irony is that the very action meant to preserve dominance accelerates the diversification that weakens it. Before this, many nations used the dollar because it was efficient and familiar. After this, they will reduce exposure because concentration now carries visible danger. That transition won't be dramatic. It will be incremental, technical, and largely invisible to the public, but it will be decisive over time. History offers plenty of warnings here. Empires rarely fall because they lose battles. They decline when maintenance costs exceed returns. When more energy is spent enforcing participation than attracting it, the equation flips. Influence becomes brittle. Every crisis demands escalation. Every escalation narrows options. Eventually, flexibility disappears. The tragedy is that alternatives existed. A managed transition toward a more multipolar system could have preserved influence while sharing control. Investment, technology, and favorable terms could have kept partners engaged voluntarily. That path required accepting reduced dominance in exchange for long-term stability. Instead, the choice was made to contest reality rather than adapt to it. Now, adaptation will happen anyway, just without coordination. New financial rails will expand, commodity pricing will fragment, regional trade hubs will grow more autonomous. The world will not become orderly overnight, but it will become less centralized. That shift was already underway. This moment simply removed doubt. Venezuela itself remains unresolved. Whether it stabilizes, fragments, or becomes a prolonged arena of competition is still unclear. What is clear is that its role has changed. It is no longer just a national crisis, it is a reference point. Other resource-rich states will study it closely, not to copy its politics, but to understand the consequences of challenging entrenched systems. The helicopters are gone, the cameras are gone. What remains is a recalibrated global calculation. Trust, once broken, does not return easily. Systems built on confidence erode faster than those built on force. But force cannot replace confidence indefinitely. Something always gives. Change was coming regardless. Energy markets were shifting, currency systems were evolving, trade routes were rebalancing. The difference now is the tone. The transition has been framed not as cooperation, but as confrontation. That choice will echo for decades, shaping alliances, investments, and conflicts in ways that won't be obvious until much later. This is why the real story starts after the spectacle fades. Because structures move slower than news cycles, but they decide outcomes. What follows will not be clean or quick. It will be contested, uneven, and expensive. And the cost will not be measured only in dollars or barrels, but in stability, trust, and the ability of nations to navigate a world where power no longer sits comfortably in one place.